Quiet Strength, Chapter 4. I was in shock after not being drafted into the NFL. Something about this didn't seem fair. It didn't seem right. I was numb, devastated. I prayed, God, I can't believe it. Help me figure out what I'm supposed to do now. I did have one opportunity to play quarterback, but it was in Canada. The Montreal Alouettes held my rights in the Canadian Football League, and their coach, Marv Levy, had spoken with me a number of times before the draft. See what happens in the draft, but keep your mind open to coming here, he said. You'd be perfect for this game with your style. You'd be in this league for a long time. Looking back, I think the National Football League couldn't figure out what to do with a black quarterback who wasn't a prototypical drop-back passing quarterback. The following year, in 1978, Doug Williams came out of Grambling State and was drafted in the first round by the Buccaneers. Doug, however, had tools I didn't have. He was about 3 inches taller than my 6'1" frame, had about 30 pounds more than my 180, and was a pocket passer with a cannon for an arm. I was more like Warren Moon, who came out of the University of Washington the same year. Warren wasn't drafted either, and he started his career in the Canadian Football League. A number of the NFL free agent calls were offering me between $1,000 and $1,500 as a signing bonus. By contrast, Montreal was offering me a bonus of $50,000. However, I'd always had my sights set on the NFL. I wanted to compete against the players I felt were the very best. I was hoping for a divine signal that would make my decision clear, even if it meant signing to play a totally new position. Lord, I'd really like to play in the NFL, but it doesn't appear to make a whole lot of sense right now. I'm pretty much got a guarantee to make the team as a quarterback in Montreal for more money, but I really want to play the NFL, even though it'd be a position I'd never played. Please help me figure out what to do. I prayed that prayer, and others like it, repeatedly over the next few days. It would have been helpful to have a clear sign as to the direction the Lord wanted me to go. Maybe something plastered on a billboard on the side of a road, or flashed on a scoreboard at a stadium, or written clearly in the clouds with a divine finger. I had to admit that I looked in all those places, just in case. At that moment, even a powerful wind, earthquake, or fire similar to what Elijah had experienced would have been helpful. Although, as it turned out, the Lord didn't appear to Elijah in any of those. Instead, it was a gentle whisper, a still, small voice, in which Elijah heard the Lord speaking. How did Elijah do that? I'd always felt I needed a loud voice or a clear sign to help me make decisions in times like that. I didn't hear the audible voice, but in my heart I still felt led to the NFL. I talked with Tom Sherman of the Buffalo Bills, who wanted to play me at free safety. I was ready to head up there to play when Tom Moore, my college coach, entered the picture again. Tom had left the University of Minnesota after my senior season and joined Woody Widenhofer as a wide receivers coach with the Pittsburgh Steelers. Tom and Woody had spoken with the Steelers head coach, Chuck Noll, and told him I was a bright guy who could fit somewhere within their organization. They didn't need another quarterback. They'd taken Cliff Stout in the 5th round, but Tom told me he was sure I could help the Steelers in some way. I updated him on the Bills situation, letting him know that Tom Sherman was mailing a contract to me the next morning. Tom Moore hopped onto a flight and brought the Steelers' contract with him, ensuring he arrived before the mail. I called Tom Sherman and explained that I knew several coaches with the Steelers and felt that it was a better opportunity. I then signed with the Pittsburgh Steelers for a bonus of $2,200 plus another $20,000 in salary if I made the team. I was so excited and sure that was where God wanted me to go. Until I started telling my friends. Are you nuts? What position do you think you're going to play? The Steelers had just missed going to their 3rd straight Super Bowl in 1976. You think you're going to play receiver? Ever heard of John Stallworth? Well, even he doesn't start at receiver for them. And 8 of the defensive guys, 8 of them, just went to the Pro Bowl, plus 3 guys from the offense. 11 guys in the Pro Bowl. Donnie Shell and Jimmy Allen are the backup DBs. Where do you think you're going to play? How are you even going to make the team? Well, I don't know. I want to play with the best, and these guys are the best. Signing with the Steelers had seemed like the right thing to do immediately after the draft, but I found myself second-guessing my decision for about a week afterward. I was just walking in faith. Faith in God and faith in what Tom had told me. You're a smart guy, so you're going to have chances to make it with us in Pittsburgh somewhere. And since we're already good, it's not like we need to give the veterans much work in the preseason. We won't need to worry about playing our first-string offense to see how they're going to function as a unit. We know how they're going to function. Coach Noll wants us to give the young guys lots of chances to play in the preseason games, so you'll get a chance to show what you can do on the field, to come in and make an impression. whenever we figure out where to put you. The more I thought about it, it didn't really seem like a logical decision at all, but I had prayed about it, and joining the Steelers had just seemed to be the right thing to do. Over and over in life, I've looked for that moment captured by Cecil B. DeMille in the Ten Commandments, when I could hear the same voice of God so clearly heard by Moses at the edge of the Red Sea. Go this way, and I'll part the waters for you. But there's been no such moment. I've yet to hear God's audible voice, although I have often felt led by God in more subtle ways. My dad always believed that God uses the logic and the passion he's given us to help direct us, and I believe that too. This must be the gentle whisper thing, the still, small voice. So I headed off to Pittsburgh with no idea what God had in store for me, either personally or professionally, in that city. It turned out that I was a wide receiver in the NFL for about 2 months. I went through the mini camps and about 2 weeks of training camp. Then, because of some injuries to other players, the Steelers moved me across the line of scrimmage to the defense at safety. I loved the challenge of learning a new position, and it was great to be in with Mel Blount, Donnie Shell, Jimmy Allen, and the rest of those guys. Fortunately for me, they were all willing to help, and our defensive coordinator, Bud Carson, was a genius. I absorbed everything I could from him. In fact, I was so busy studying and watching game films that the coaches let me borrow a 16mm projector so I could watch them in my room. Unfortunately, the projector somehow interfered with the television reception, causing snow on the veteran player's TV screen. In addition to many great players, that team included some really solid Christians. Because of our physical and rough style of the play, we weren't necessarily seen as a group of believers, but even head coach Chuck Knoll, who was a devout Catholic, often used Bible verses to inspire us. When Mark Brunell, Tony Dungy, Kyle Brady, and other Jacksonville Jaguar players were criticized in the late 1990s for not being tough enough on the football field because they were Christians, I could only think of our Steelers teams of the 1970s and smile. Larry Brown, John Kolb, Donnie Shell, and John Stallworth all really worked hard to put God first in everything they did, every day. What would Jesus do? They asked, well before bracelets and bumper stickers made that phrase popular. Donnie, in particular, was one of the most fired-up Christians I've ever met. He was the captain of the special teams when I arrived, and he was determined to become a starter on defense, even with the great players the Steelers had then. He and John Stallworth were best friends. Both were great examples for me. John Kolb and Larry Brown, two of the biggest, strongest linemen I knew, both had mild, gentle spirits. When I arrived in Pittsburgh, they were still known as the Steel Curtain and had tough, somewhat negative image. Once I stepped inside the circle, I realized how far from the truth that perception was. It was refreshing to see how different these guys were from any other group I'd ever been around. So here he is. Tony joins the Steelers. He's not sure what's going to happen. He knows he's not going to be quarterback like he always dreamed. But he ends up moving to the defense side of things and becomes a safety. And through that, he meets a lot of really strong Christians. And that starts to propel him in his faith in ways that he had never expected before. As I alluded to earlier, I've always had a problem with my temper. I often earned technical fouls in my high school basketball games and was known to lose my control in cool in football games as well. In high school and college, I was a perfectionist, usually riding my teammates rather than encouraging them. Venting, I called it. Dumb, my dad called it. Our exchanges usually ran something like this. Did you change the referee's call? No. Did it make the situation better? No, but I felt better, and then I could focus. Well, you might have felt better faster if you were thinking about the next play instead of taking 3 or 4 or 10 plays to vent. You waste a lot of emotion and energy in venting or in worrying about an injustice or something you can't do anything about. That was excellent advice from my dad, but I wasn't ready to listen. It wasn't until those Steelers invited me into their Bible study that I really began to change. There I was exposed to the guys I respected who were constantly in God's Word, always praying and reading their Bibles together. These professional players were not the weak and meek. They were some of the biggest, toughest guys I'd ever met. And yet they were drawing their strength and purpose from God. I had known from a young age I was going to heaven, but I had never fully engaged God and let him direct my life moment by moment until I saw those guys doing it. I'd been a good kid, by and large. I stayed out of trouble, was usually polite, and stood up for my values. Yet the concept of putting God first in everything I did hadn't been my primary focus. Finally, I understood, and I started to move from being a casual Christian to a fully committed follower of Jesus. It's funny, you never know when that's going to happen to you in your life. I guarantee you, Tony had no idea it was going to happen, right, in the locker room and on the field of the Steelers when he was surrounded by some of the biggest and toughest guys in the NFL. My crash course in playing safety must have worked because I was still on the team as we headed into the final cuts before the regular season. Some of my success resulted from my efforts to absorb the defensive scheme by asking questions and watching films on my own, but a good bit of it stemmed from the fact that I bought into Coach Knoll's approach so quickly. As the Steelers minicamp shortly after the draft, I had taken to heart Coach Knoll's words about what it took to win in the National Football League. "Champions don't beat themselves," he told us. "If you want to win, do the ordinary things better than anyone else does, day in and day out. We're not going to fool people or out-scheme them. We're just going to outplay them, because we'll know what we're doing. When we get into critical situations, we won't have to think. We'll play fast and fundamentally sound." Chuck Knoll developed much of his coaching philosophy from the legendary Paul Brown, and I got mine from Chuck. I tell people that I'm from the Paul Brown School of Football. It was the summer of 1977, and I still hadn't made the team. In those days, the relationship of the football clubs and the media was different. Local reporters traveled on the team charter to games. I vividly recall Dwight White, our Pro Bowl defensive end, sitting in the back of the plane, blowing cigar smoke rings while talking with Vito Stellino, one of Pittsburgh's beat writers at the time. Vito always had good information, in part because he was good at what he did, and in part because he sat in the back of the plane with Dwight White. After training camp, we stayed at the historic William Penn Hotel in downtown Pittsburgh. Coach Knoll made the rookie room assignments alphabetically, so my roommate was linebacker Robin Cole, the first-round draft choice from the University of New Mexico. I had met Robin at a college all-star game our senior year, so we were pretty good friends by then. We played our last preseason game on a Friday night and had the weekend off until Monday's team meeting. The last cut would be made on Saturday or Sunday, whenever the coaching staff made their decision. On Saturday morning, I picked up a paper and immediately turned to Vito Stellino's article detailing which guys were going to get cut. My name was on Vito's list. I figured that if the story was in the paper, Vito must have gotten his information from the coaches, Dwight, or some other reliable source. I decided not to leave the hotel all weekend. I didn't want to miss that phone call. The last thing I wanted was to walk into Monday morning's team meeting and get cut in front of a room full of guys. Meanwhile, my roommate Robin was gone for much of the weekend. He was relaxing, coming and going from the hotel with the confident swagger of a first-round draft pick. For the second time in 4 months, I sat for 2 solid days beside a phone that never rang. I kept calling down to the front desk. "Are you sure there aren't any calls from my room?" Monday rolled around. It was a hot, steamy September morning in Pittsburgh. I drove to the facility with Robin, sneaking into the back of the locker room so nobody could see me. They had left my stuff in my locker. I was just about to take my personal belongings when I saw my nameplate on my locker. It was still there. Suddenly I realized I've made the team. I played it cool, making sure everything was hung up neatly, acting as if I was just doing a bit of rearranging. I don't think Coach Knoll even realizes what an important lesson I learned that weekend. It was an unforgettable and excruciating experience, that entire weekend of sitting and waiting. To this day, I make sure to tell our guys exactly when cuts are coming, and I try to give them a 1-hour time window to stay by their phones. I mean, imagine that. You're just waiting by your phone for your whole future essentially to be decided, and he had to do that 4 months prior, right? Is he, with the NFL draft, and now, is he going to make the team? And just think about like the nerves that he went through with that. And so he says, he practices a different style with his team now because 2 days of going through that's just torture. Early in that first season, the issue of drinking and drugs, something I thought I'd already dealt with, finally came to a climax for me. During my first road trip as a Steeler, everyone was given 2 beers as we boarded the flight home after the game. I certainly wasn't prepared for this, and I wasn't sure what I should do. I definitely wanted to fit in and be like everyone else, but I also knew that if I drank the beer, I probably wouldn't be able to drive once we landed in Pittsburgh. Fortunately, I saw a few of the other guys give their beer away, and that little nudge of positive peer pressure helped me not to give in to something I didn't really want to do. That year, 1977, I had a fair amount of playing time at the safety position, and I ended up intercepting 3 passes for the season. One of those interceptions came in a game that was remarkable, at least from my point of view. Back in May, when I had been anxiously sitting by my phone during the NFL draft, the Steelers had selected a quarterback named Cliff Stout from Youngstown State University in the 5th round. Now, in an October game at Houston, both starting quarterback Terry Bradshaw and backup Mike Krunzik were knocked out of the game with injuries. Cliff was on the inactive roster that day, so I was brought in at quarterback to finish up the fourth quarter. I played terribly. I fumbled a snap, and Rocky Blyer and I fumbled a handoff. I didn't realize the backs took the ball differently at Pittsburgh than they had done in college. To make matters worse, I threw 2 interceptions near the end of our 27-10 loss. In the process, I became the last player in NFL history to intercept a pass and throw an interception in the same game. I felt awful about my performance because I knew I had cost us the game. Despite my disappointment, however, I realized I had done something very few people would ever do. I took snaps from Mike Webster, handed off to Franco Harris, and threw passes to Lynn Swann and John Stallworth, all during a regular season NFL game. If I'd practiced with the offense at all, the fumbles wouldn't have occurred. However, I once again began focusing on how I could continue to improve as an NFL safety. Monday was an off day for players, but that day, while I was watching TV, the phone rang. It was Coach Knoll's secretary. The coach wanted to see me right away. When I arrived in his office, Coach Knoll updated me on the situation. Bradshaw was getting his wrist x-rayed, and Kruzik will be out for an extended period of time. They were in the process of trying to locate Neil Graff, a quarterback who had been with us during training camp and was now somewhere in Canada on a hunting trip. In the meantime, Coach Knoll told me to attend the quarterbacks meeting that afternoon. I immediately wondered about Cliff Stout. After all, Coach Knoll had drafted him, not me. Cliff might have struggled in the preseason, but I had been playing defense and hadn't practiced 1 minute at quarterback. Coach Knoll answered before I could even ask my question. As always, his assessment was brief and to the point. We have some questions at quarterback right now. As the week goes on, we'll have a better idea about Terry, Neil, and Cliff. We'll see who gives us the best chance to win. If you do, you're going to play. If we have another option that gives us a better chance, you'll go back to safety. After the quarterbacks meeting, I raced home and began calling my buddies. I might be starting on Monday Night Football against Cincinnati at quarterback. The next day, they did locate Neil Graff, and Terry Bradshaw checked out healthy enough to play with a cast. I was back at safety. But even so, in the days and years to follow, I drew great satisfaction from knowing that Coach Knoll had confidence that I could go in and play quarterback and direct all those future Hall of Famers. Some people had suggested to me that I wasn't drafted as a quarterback because of my race. At first, I didn't agree. I just figured that playing quarterback in the NFL was completely different from playing in college. But after talking with coaches and scouts that first year, I grew less certain. A number of them said they had passed on me in the draft because of quantifiable characteristics such as my height and arm strength. Later in the season, however, when we played guys like Bob Grease, Joe Ferguson, and Fran Tarkenton, I would deliberately walk by, look them in the eye, and measure my height against theirs. I was as tall as each one of them. I began to wonder if race had indeed played a role. To make matters worse, when I saw the backup QBs, now that was really frustrating. A lot of them just weren't very good. I continued to wonder. During that week in the middle of the 1977 season, I realized that quarterbacking in the NFL was ultimately no different from playing quarterback at any other level. I believe I could have done it, given the opportunity. But I didn't get that opportunity, and whether it was because of my race or because of some legitimate factor, it was time to move on. Okay, so imagine that. Imagine seeing these guys that you know that you're better than, and yet they got the position over you. But flip side of that is that his coach has a lot of confidence in him, right? Coach Knoll, even though he messed up, right, when he was put in towards the end of that game, his coach still has confidence that given the right tools and the right practice that he could, right, start as a quarterback in the NFL. And that has to give him confidence, right, that people do believe in him. In the following offseason, I was able to work out regularly at the stadium. I added about 8 pounds to my frame, reaching 188 pounds. Back then, the Steelers and the Pirates shared Pittsburgh's Three Rivers Stadium, so I tried to schedule my off-season workouts, which fell during the Pirates' regular season, for the middle of the day. I often wrapped up my workout and headed next door to the Pirates clubhouse, just in time to see guys like John Candelari, Bert Blythelin, Dave Parker, Phil Gardner, Vinny Stennett, and Omar Moreno. The Pirates clubhouse was noisy, worlds apart from the silence and anxiety of a football locker room on game day. The baseball players were frying chicken and playing cards, yelling back and forth, answering mail, and listening to radios. In the middle of the bedlam, I saw my first Spanish-language Bible as Manny Sanguilina sat in his locker, as I learned he always did, quietly reading. The next season, when the Pirates added Bill Madlock and Tim Foley and were on their way to a World Series win with their We Are Family theme, I asked Willie Stargell about the noisy atmosphere in the clubhouse on game day. Isn't it a little distracting? Willie flashed that broad smile of his and then laughed as he decided the question was funnier than he first thought. He looked at the wiry 24-year-old Steeler in front of him and spoke thoughtfully. I've been playing baseball for a long time, Tony. When I look over in your locker room on game day, I can't believe how tight everybody is. As for me, every time I've ever heard the umpire get ready to start a game, he always says, "Play ball." I've never once heard him say, "Work ball." I think that's something you football guys have forgotten. I filed that away, not realizing how often I would draw on that thought later when I had teens of my own to guide through a pregame setting. Which is so true, right? If you think about baseball, they always say, "Play ball," right before a game, and right? Because that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to have fun. You're supposed to play ball. But in the football locker room, it's all solemn and silence and intensity. And Tony notices that difference versus the baseball locker room. I wonder if that's still true today. I had gained those 8 pounds by lifting and running and preparing in ways I'd never had as a quarterback. I was headed into the 1978 training camp with a year of playing defense under my belt. I was still watching as much film as possible and absorbing everything I could from Woody Widenhofer as the guys on the defense. Physically and mentally, I knew it was going to be a much better year for me. But then I started dragging a little, feeling a little tired as camp approached. I headed over to camp a couple of days early, and the team doctor checked me out. Mononucleus. If you have known me and my dating habits back then, you know that mono isn't always the kissing disease. I was focused on my career as much as anything, but I was also pretty shy. I did know a few girls, and I enjoyed being around them, but before I got too involved with someone, I wanted to be sure she was someone I could see myself marrying. Because of that, I never really had a serious girlfriend. I was probably looking for someone like my mom. Up to then, I hadn't found her. The doctor put me on antibiotics just in case I had other infection in addition to mono, and told me he would check on me every few days. I would be allowed to take the field when my white blood cell count dropped back down to normal levels. I started to improve quickly, but day after day, my white blood cell count was still too high. After missing 3 weeks, preseason lasted just about forever back then. I was really frustrated and it was getting difficult to be around. Late one evening in our room, I told Donnie Shell, I don't know that I'm going to make this team. By the time I get back, my conditioning level will be down. And there are other new guys who are looking to do what I did last year. Take somebody's spot. This is just not going to be going according to plan. Tony, I think you're at a crossroads, Donnie said. You know what life is all about. You profess to be a Christian, and you tell everybody that God has first place in your life. Now, when your career looks like it's teetering, we're getting a chance to see what really is in first place for you. I thought about that all day and then came back to the conversation with Donnie. You're probably right, I told him. I feel like I've been learning from you guys and growing, and I'm feeling better about my faith and thinking that I trust the Lord. I'm trying to understand what you guys have. But all of a sudden, I come to a crisis point and I begin to panic. My thoughts turn to, what am I going to do? Donnie paused and measured me squarely. All the Lord is trying to do is find out what's in first place in your life. And right now, it looks like football is. I immediately knew Donnie was right, and I felt convicted. I think there was a point at which I really began to understand what it means to be a Christian, and I began making an effort to start changing and growing as a person. It was the first time I was able to look at football as something that God was allowing me to do, not something that should define me. I couldn't take my identity from this sport. I had to consciously make sure that God was in first place. Now that I'm older and gone through many much more difficult crises than those first 3 weeks of mono, I look back at that time as key to my maturity as a Christian. Several days later, I still wasn't better, but I had begun to simply pray that whether I sat out the entire year, came back immediately, or was cut, I would keep God first. About 2 weeks later, as we were getting ready for our first preseason game, I was finally able to start practicing again. It was one of those miracle years. I was healthy, and it seemed like every time I took the field, the ball was headed my way. We went 14-2 and won the Super Bowl over Dallas, 35-31. I led the team in interceptions and was tied for 10th in the NFL. I was one interception behind Herm Edwards, who would coach with me years later, though I think he would gladly trade that interception for being able to fish as well as I can. Despite all those good things that occurred that year, I can still look back and say that 1978 was the first season in my life in which sports weren't the most important thing to me. I finally realized that how I lived on earth was just as important as my salvation. God had me here for a reason, and it wasn't just to play ball. It was then that the words of Matthew 16:26 really started to sink in. And what do you benefit if you gain the whole world but lose your own soul? Okay, so that's a neat reset moment for Tony, right? Because he gets mono. He's like, I'm not going to make the team. Like, what am I going to do? My career's over. And he starts questioning everything. And his teammate, Donnie, who's a strong Christian, is like, so the first time something goes bad, you question the Lord and everything, and your faith goes out the window? What is this? This is a very pivotal time for Tony when he realizes, okay. He says, it was the first time I was able to look at football as something that God was allowing me to do, not something that should define me. And he goes on to have this really amazing season in part because he puts his priorities in line. And if you reread that whole last paragraph, right, he says, I can still look back and say that 1978 was the first season in my life in which sports weren't the most important thing to me, right? He put all of his identity, all of his worth, everything in sports before that season. But getting mono changed all that for him. Right. I finally realized that how I lived on earth was just as important as my salvation. God had me here for a reason, and it wasn't just to play ball. As Matthew 16:26 says, and what do you benefit if you gain the whole world but lose your own soul? And so that's a pivotal moment in Tony's life.